Hey guys, my name's Lily, and I'm going to be talking about the idea that artificial food dyes are not what's killing you or harming you, but rather your lack of nutritional knowledge. Let's talk about it. So, for the purpose of this video, I focused on one general study done by the Environmental Health by Med Central, published in 2022. The primary authors were Miller GF and Smith L. The title of this article, or sorry, this study was Potential Impacts of Synthetic Food Dyes on Activity and Attention in Children, a review of the human and animal evidence. I do have some more after this that I'm going to talk about. Before these facts, that's what I'm going to be referencing, that specific journal. And so basically, the scope of this study was to review and analyze 25 double-blind, placebo-controlled challenge studies in children to assess links between synthetic food dyes and behavior. And so what does that mean? So there were 25 children who were given either a placebo or a artificial food dye. A child didn't know if they were being given the real thing or something fake, as well as the adult giving it to them also didn't know if it was a placebo or the real thing. So this eliminated some biases of the adult being like, oh, well, I know it's a placebo, so they're just faking it. Or the kid being like, oh, I know it's the real thing, so I'm going to play it up. Right? Okay, so what this study found was that 64% found evidence of worsened behavior, such as hyperactivity and reduced attention, following food dye exposure. 52% reported statistically significant associations between dye consumption and increased hyperactivity or attention problems. Within those percentages, higher dye exposure also correlated to a stronger behavioral effect. So the higher the dose, the higher the reaction. One thing they did talk about in this journal was that there could also be just genetic differences among the individuals who were in this study, and sensitivity could be higher in others than someone else taking the same thing. So that was in a child study. In animal evidence of food dye toxicology data, um, I'm going to be referencing the International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health, published in 2012. Primary authors on this were Kobyleski S., Jacobson M.F., and the title was Toxicology of Food Dyes. So the purpose of this study was to review 9 synthetic food dyes that were approved in the United States and assess the animal, human, and biochemical data on carcinogenicity, genotoxicity, and hypersensitivity. Carcinogenicity, I'll put them up there. Cancer causing, toxic to your genomes, and sensitivity. All right, the dyes studied, whoa, I'm gonna take a break. All right, so the dyes studied were blue 1, blue 2, green 3, red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, citrus red 2, and orange B. So those were the 9 dyes used in this study. So red number 3 was shown to cause thyroid tumors in rats across multiple different studies and was recognized by the FDA as a carcinogen in 1990, yet remained in food use for years after. That's red number 3. So that one you won't necessarily find in commonly sold foods in the US now. Citrus red number 2 was shown to produce liver and bladder tumors in animal experiments. Yellow number 6 and red number 40 contain trace contaminants that are both classified as human carcinogens. That word, the key words there were trace contaminants, because we know that those food dyes are still used, but because they can only prove trace contaminants if the FDA approves those trace amounts that don't necessarily show up in your system, and there's no studies on long-term effects, then they can say it's safe for consumption at that level. Now going into genotoxicity, yellow number 5, which is also called tartrazine, and yellow number 6, which is also called sunset yellow, were shown to cause DNA damage and chromosomal abnormalities in some cell and animal studies. However, the results varied by testing method and dose level. So there was no blanket statement of this amount's good, this amount's bad, this amount, yeah. It varied by the test. Red number 40, which is also called Allura red, had mixed results across the studies. While some were positive for mutagenesis or genotoxic potential, higher concentrations under certain metabolic conditions showed some damage, but there were no reliable, consistent results. So now we're going to be talking about contaminants and chronic exposure. Multiple dyes, including red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, were found to contain carcinogenic contaminants like benzidine. And while present at trace levels, the authors in the article that I referenced before, the authors caution that chronic low-level exposure across a population could build a cumulative risk. And so one concern that these authors, Kobleski and Jacobson, discussed in this journal were the testing deficiencies, and that talking about many safety studies date back to the 1960s, 1970s. So they're using outdated methods of tracking how these things affect our bodies. And there are also gaps within the lack of modern carcinogenicity and developmental neurotoxicity testing, and there are incomplete chronic exposure data. The FDA's acceptable daily intakes may underestimate real world risk. And so, what does all of that mean? Basically, the conclusion that these two came to in 2012 was that for most adults, single day dye intake is below the FDA's level, so they're safe. However, the main concern isn't acute toxicity, but rather it's the long-term exposure to multiple dyes that may not be fully accounted for by the FDA. Hey guys, interrupting myself. Watching that back, I didn't feel like I fully explained in the briefest way possible what I was trying to say. The FDA approves a certain amount based on a 2,000 calorie diet. So it's like technically you're fine if you consume that. However, they don't take into account children who are being fed red 40 across 3 different meals, or yellow, sunset yellow, and 2 different snacks, and combining all these different food dyes across multiple different meals or snacks. And then there's now a buildup of those dyes in their, what's the word I'm looking for? There's now a buildup of those dyes in their daily intake that the FDA does not think of, or I'm sure they think of, but they might not have studied it the same, whereas they're approving this amount of red 40, but then you're unintentionally giving children this amount 4 times a day based on a 2,000 calorie diet when that's not the 2,000 calories that they are consuming. So you may say, well, I don't buy anything that lists red 40, yellow 6, like the obvious, color number. It's a food dye, obviously. But there are also aliases for these food dyes that you may not know about. I'm going to list all of them somewhere, probably both sides of me, because there's a lot. So I'm going to have the common dye, what is actually like the number name that it's known most commonly as. And then in the middle is going to be the alternate or technical names you may see. There's going to be some notes for some of them. So for example, the first one, yellow 5, is also called tartrazine E102, acid yellow 23, FD-ANC yellow 5, and just color in some jurisdictions. Tartrazine is one of the better known ones. I referenced that earlier in the study that they used that language. And so how does all of this matter? How do I use this information when reading a nutrition label? Or where do I even begin when reading a nutrition label to know if what I'm reading is good for me or not? when you are reading a food nutrition label, the ingredients list is listed by how much of that is in the food from most to least by weight. So if artificial flavor is listed as the last thing in the ingredients list and there's no other color names in that ingredient, what that means is there's only a tiny amount of any artificial coloring in that. And so under FDA regulations, they can do that. They can list artificial flavor as a reference to any flavoring that is not a natural source or is made from chemical compounds to imitate natural flavors. And because it's such a trace amount, they don't need to go into depth about like 1 milligram of yellow, 1 teaspoon. Like they don't need to do that because it's not enough in one serving to be a concern. While on the topic of nutrition labels, let's talk about how the FDA decided, or while on the dog, kind of looks like you guys. Pups. Anyway, nutrition label. While on the topic of nutrition labels, everything that the FDA has decided that needs to be there, right? At the very top, you have serving size. It typically shows the amount of food eaten at one time, or so they claim. We all have seen videos where that's not necessarily the case. Like you take a handful of Cinnamon Toast Crunch and it's like actually 3 times the serving size. Anyway, so then there's servings per container, obviously, and serving sizes are set by FDA regulations based on what people actually eat, not what they should eat. Calories indicate how much energy you get from that food, and this number typically helps people calculate, obviously, calorie intake versus output and meet dietary goals. The nutrients that have to be listed on an FDA label are the total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbohydrate, dietary fiber, total sugars, and added sugars, as well as protein, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. Sometimes if they are advertising like a micronutrient rich, then obviously they'll list more, but those are required. And they're usually listed or in grams and milligrams. And on the far right, you can see the daily value of how much that makes up of what it makes up of a 2,000 calorie reference. So 2,000 calorie reference is used for all food labels, but that does not mean everybody eats 2,000 calories. A 250-pound man is going to be drastically different than a 100-pound teenage girl. See what I'm saying? They're not both eating 2,000 calories, so that serving size is a recommendation. Combining those two, looking at the nutritional label and at the ingredient list, sometimes you will see, typically more when you're looking at pharmaceutical products, you'll see an active versus an inactive ingredient list. And so what does that mean? How is it active or not active, right? So according to the US Pharmacopoeia, active ingredients are the components in a drug that are intended to produce a therapeutic effect. So they are chemically active substances responsible for the reaction on your body. An example of this is in an ibuprofen tablet, the active ingredient is ibuprofen. It reduces pain and inflammation. But inactive ingredients are substances that do not have a direct effect on your body. So they usually serve purposes like improving the stability of the product, absorption, flavor, texture, or appearance. An example of this would be a gelatin being listed as an inactive ingredient because the capsule is a gelatin capsule. All right, well, that's all I got for today. So go ahead and like the video, hit subscribe if you want to see some more content, and definitely go in the comments. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to talk more about, and we'll be in touch. Bye.